Sam Husseini is our guest on Geopolitics and Empire. He's a DC-based independent journalist. We will be discussing COVID-1984, as I like to call it. But more importantly, we'll be discussing the biodefense and biowarfare arms race that is every bit as dangerous, if not even more so, than the nuclear arms race. Let me just remind listeners to subscribe to all of our channels on social media, share, like, and leave us a podcast review, as well as a donation, if you can, via Bitcoin, Patreon, or PayPal. I would also urge listeners to subscribe to our email list that includes our podcast interview and a collection of important news headlines. So, okay, thank you for joining us, Mr. Husseini.
Good to be with you.
I thought we'd start with an important quote from your latest article, which says, quote, "People who are dismissing the possibility that the pandemic might have come from a lab, either accidentally from a Wuhan lab or them being effectively framed, as we saw with the 2001 anthrax attacks, are basically risking the future of humanity because they don't want to have an uncomfortable discussion." So, end quote. So it seems that people fall into two camps on this issue. You know, people who are heavily invested with this idea that public and prestigious private institutions are holy and never corrupt. And then there are others from the other side, we're a bit more skeptical. And so when I have discussions with people who are bought into the official narrative, usually they're involved in medicine, they never seem to address any of my factual scientific concerns related to political corruption, gain-of-function research, some of the documented history, and so on. They tend to ridicule and repeat the CDC, WHO, Bill Gates spiel. So before we go deeper, could you tell us your thoughts on this struggle and this debate?
Absolutely. There is, sort of a third position, which has in the last month or so gotten a lot of play, and that's a sort of demonized China position, and that their labs are bad and that U.S. labs are good. That's certainly the position staked out by Tom Cotton. It seems to be adopted to some extent, increasingly by Fox News and the Trump administration, and it's also resonating in parts of the Democratic Party. Christopher Murphy, Democratic, I think he's a senator, seems to be fingering the Wuhan labs in, again, a, attacking China sort of posture. And I think that part of the liberal position of idolatry of, scientific research and so on that you allude to, or the alleged establishment, the alleged scientific establishment, I think that they're partly, and this might be too generous of a reading, that they're partly motivated by a reaction to the fear of the demonizing China that some of the right wing is doing. But I think that their general compulsion to just simply trust institutions is, as you say, extremely dangerous. I mean, we look at what we've lived through. Look at what we're seeing now, the financial collapse, the entire economic profession largely complicit with the housing bubble and so on. You have fields which are corrupted and corruptible. There's been so much money, especially after 9/11 and after the anthrax attacks, which were clearly designed to finger Arabs, either Saddam Hussein or Al Qaeda, with letters that went out to members of Congress and members of the media with "Death to America" scrawled on them, and used as justification by media pundits to ramp up the attacks on Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as ran through the Patriot Act. All of that happened in 2001. We still haven't gotten to the bottom of that. There was a mechanism there that effectively framed Iraq and Al Qaeda and so on. We don't know if we are in a similar mechanism here, or that it simply was what it appears to be, which is an accidental leak from one of the labs in Wuhan. And I'm open-minded. I mean, I don't feel like I've seen definitive evidence. I don't know that it had nothing to do with any lab. I still hold that out as a possibility. I just don't understand why a lot of people, including the media from early on, including a concerted effort from a lot of well-connected scientists in the Lancet letter and the Nature Medicine article, are dismissive or attempting to distract from the possibility that it came out of a lab, whether that's a lab in Wuhan or whether that's some other lab that effectively is attempting to frame the lab in Wuhan.
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I think we should keep an open mind. I do as well, and as we get new information, we should recalibrate our thinking. I'm from the evidence we've seen so far. I mean, my opinion is I think it did come from a lab, but again, which one? That's a difficult question to answer. We've discovered, I think it has been reported lately, that Anthony Fauci and the NIH may have violated a moratorium on gain of function research. I think it was in 2014. And that funding went to the Wuhan Lab from the U.S. It was something like $3.7 or $4 million. And I believe it was today, I don't know if you've seen it, that Mike Pompeo came out and defended that U.S. funding for the Wuhan Lab. So what do you make of that?
Things are changing rapidly, so I might have missed something, as you say, but it's my understanding. I mean, I saw a piece co-written by at least one of the virologists at the Wuhan Lab, the BSL-4 that they have there, with North Carolina, U.S. scientists at University of North Carolina and Harvard and some other universities. And in that document, which did do gain-of-function work and published in 2015, this is a year after an alleged pause in gain-of-function research. And for your listeners who aren't familiar, gain-of-function basically means you're doing lab work that's attempting to make a pathogen more deadly. This is allegedly for the purpose of anticipating what the terrorists or what nature will throw at us so that we will be able to better combat it. They got the first part right. They don't seem to have done anything that's useful to us at this point. But it's my understanding that in that document, which was also published, I believe, by Nature Medicine in 2015, they say that they got an exemption, and there were exemptions for this gain-of-function research. And they also notably didn't initially disclose their funding from USAID in that document or from this outfit called the EcoHealth Alliance, which has also been very vocal in pretending that a leak from a lab is virtually inconceivable and doing other things to sort of muddy the waters and has been involved with this research of collecting viruses, pathogens from bats, manipulating them, and so on. One of their president was on Democracy Now! And was just given a total puff interview. Democracy Now! Depicted the possibility of a lab release as Trump's position, not a position, not a concern of a great number of people, including scientists, but it's Trump's position, and therefore implicitly it needs to be dismissed. Democracy Now! Didn't even acknowledge at that until that show, well into April, that there was a lab in Wuhan that might have conceivably been the release. So I think that there are several corruptions going on here. One is a scientific corruption, and one is a journalistic corruption, which I think extends to a great deal of at least the U.S. media.
Beyond the origins of COVID-19, which it's still hard to figure out, you ask perhaps even more important question in your latest Salon piece: the fact that governments around the world have been for decades, perhaps even going back a century, experimenting with all kinds of biological warfare and research, gain of function, trying to make pathogens more deadly, as you say, experimenting on their own populations. We know the U.S. has done that, perhaps none more so than the U.S. I'm not sure. What are the dangers of this biodefense industry and this biological warfare arms race?
This is something that Francis Boyle, who I know you've had on the show, has written about. He wrote the relevant U.S. law implementing the Biological Weapons Convention, and the Biological Weapons Convention presumably made any kind of biowarfare illegal. Unfortunately, they've attempted to get around that restriction, led by the United States, to basically say, oh, we're not doing biowarfare, we're doing biodefense. And part of biodefense is anticipating what the terrorists or what nature might throw at us. So we have to create more deadly pathogens so that we can figure out how to combat them. Well, it could well be a simple pretext. And of course, the scientists who do this work ultimately don't have control over what they create. The governments and government agencies ultimately have control as to what use their work will be put to. So I think that the danger, regardless of what the cause of this pandemic is, the danger is very real, both in terms of risks of accidental leak, and there's a long and documented history of them that I go through in my 2 articles. From 2014 to 2017, there was actually a reporter at USA Today who documented all of these leaks and studies about leaks in U.S. labs and so on. And prior to that, there was and just this last year, there was a leak at Fort Detrick, which now they're about to open the biggest lab, apparently, in the entire world. So there's been this dramatic escalation of these labs. They do have accidents, and they were, I mean, it's sort of an insane loop that you have here because, again, during the anthrax attacks, the best information we have is that they came out of a U.S. or a U.S. allied lab. This anthrax that was obviously designed to appear as to looking, as if it came from a U.S. hating Arab of some variety, but it came out of a U.S. lab. And what's the reaction? To dramatically escalate the spending on these quote unquote defense / bioweapons labs. And actually a group of scientists in 2015, some 700 scientists signed a petition to the NIH saying, you're totally distorting our field with all of this funding for bioweapons. And it was Fauci who responded, who basically said the American people have spoken by electing their political leadership. He's referring to the Bush-Cheney administration there. And this is what the political leadership wants. And he fundamentally said, I linked to this New York Times story about this from 2015 in my Salon piece. He basically says, if we don't have a seat at the table, then it's just going to go through the military. So, basically telling the scientific community to put up or shut up. And since then, tens and tens of billions of dollars have poured into the field, further distorting the field, further making it, effectively an arm of the so-called national security state. So I think that the threat there is very real, and this has predictably spawned other countries to similarly act. And so you have effectively a U.S.-led biological weapons arms race.
Yeah, this is all very scary stuff. And you mentioned earlier China. And, I remember when I did the interview with Francis Boyle, he's pointing out that it most likely leaked from the Wuhan Lab, so from China. And then I was kind of a bit dismayed when I heard Senator Tom Cotton coming out, building up this kind of anti-China narrative, because, I don't think anyone wants war. And it seems, China has replaced the Soviet Union in this new Cold War. And so we've switched from Russia now to China. And I think we can look at things. We don't have to go into one category, and they seem to be skipping the part that the U.S. was funding that Wuhan lab. So then ultimately, I think responsibility would go back to the U.S. and not solely China. So they seem to now be building a narrative that it's only China and, forgetting about that funding that went to the Wuhan lab.
Again, you have different tentacles of the U.S. government and establishment, and I think that they Trump administration or the NIH, I'm not sure which, cut off the funding for the EcoHealth Alliance, which had been helping fund that Wuhan lab. So I don't know if that's a way to sweep that under the rug so that you could just focus on demonizing China. And I think the entire sort of spectrum, it's been evident for some years. So the entire U.S. political spectrum, each political faction sort of demonizes an external enemy. So you have, Trump demonizing a lot of Muslims and Latinos, and then you had the Democratic establishment demonizing Russia, at least for the last 3 years, if not longer. And now you have sort of a combination of the two from sort of the Tucker Carlson, wing of the Republican Party, and also Cotton, as well as, you have Biden, who's been a China basher of some stripe for many years. He's not simply trying to keep up with Trump. That is a long-standing position of Biden's. So yeah, I think that it is dangerous. And the flip side of that is that you have other people like David Ignatius in the Washington Post, as well as the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. and others, basically saying, "Oh no, we have to cooperate." And I disagree with both positions. I disagree with demonizing China, and I disagree with the notion that the U.S. and Chinese government need to cooperate if cooperate, as they mean it, means to find a way to collude. This is basically what you have with the U.S. and Russia in terms of nuclear weapons. The U.S. and Russia basically enter into an agreement of sabotaging, attempts to reduce or eliminate, as with the nuclear weapons ban treaty, nuclear weapons. So when 122 countries tried several years ago, and the group behind it got the Nobel Peace Prize to try to eliminate nuclear weapons, that was fundamentally sabotaged by the US and Russia. And I think that we need to stand in opposition to that. Saying that you don't want them to collude against humanity isn't the same as saying you want them to have a war. We want them to both be accountable and to both meaningfully disarm.
One of my last questions was related to censorship, and you've written about on your website, Husseini.posthaven.com. You've written about you attend public briefings and events, and you give hard questions to public officials, and they don't like taking your questions. I think you've written how they avoid you, and I think you were, if I'm not mistaken, you attended that meeting and you were kicked out. If it was, I think, in Helsinki. So can you speak a little bit about your experience in trying to ask these public officials questions and being censored or criticized?
Right. Well, I was just thinking about that because that was related to the nuclear weapons ban treaty. That was I went to Helsinki, covered it for The Nation magazine, and attempted to ask Trump and Putin about nuclear weapons ban treaty, why they were standing in the way of these 122 countries trying to ban nuclear weapons. And, how am I going to get a question in when you have a ton of room full of media? So I had a little sign that said nuclear weapons ban. And I thought that, I stood a chance if I held up the sign of Trump or Putin, sort of impulsively calling on me. And that's not how it went down. They ended up, seeing that I had a sign and literally dragging me out of the hall. And I was locked up for 6 hours until the media centers closed at around midnight Helsinki time, so that effectively I couldn't get my message out. And sometimes I do get a question. And for example, at the now shuttered National Press Club on February 11th, I asked the CDC about the Wuhan Lab, and they said no, it's of animal origin. And then I said, well, those two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. That is, and audio of this is on my website as well. I said, those two things aren't mutually exclusive, are they? Because you could have it of animal origin, but the lab could have collected it from these bat caves that people have pointed to, which are 1,000 miles away from Wuhan, where the outbreak happened and where the labs are. So those two things aren't mutually exclusive, and they wouldn't answer that. And I thought that was very interesting. I think you can learn a lot from what they don't answer. So I think that both restricting and taming media from answering tough questions, the fact that so-called independent media has become so timid. And I know that your interview with Francis Boyle, who I don't necessarily fully agree with, because he's saying that it was bioengineered, and I've not seen that, or I'm not a scientist. I'm not seeing any scientists other than the French Nobel Prize winner in medicine, I believe. But both his interview and the Nobel Prize winner in medicine's interview have been either flagged or outright censored on corporate social media, what's called social media, but what is actually just another name for unaccountable corporate media. I've also seen attempts by corporate social media to go after Last American Vagabond, which is where Whitney Webb is writing. I think she's doing some very interesting work. She used to write for Mint Press and did a series on the whole Jeffrey Epstein story and his connections to various power centers. And they I think got demonetized on YouTube. So you see a whole series of layers of how various institutions, including corporate media institutions, attempt to rein in critical information.
Yeah, I was actually supposed to interview Whitney this weekend, but she's been very busy. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, they do.
I didn't realize I was just filler for Whitney. That's okay.
No, I try to line up as many people as I can get, and they do good work at Last American Vagabond. And this censorship is frightening. It seems like it's just they're turning up the dial, and there's people like I think his name Dave Rubin from the Rubin Report. He thinks that within 2 years that YouTube will only have like verified voices. So some of us are slowly, backing up our files and interviews on the alternative channels, but we're still doing our thing. We're still going strong. Are there any other items that you think are important that I haven't brought up, or any final thought to leave us with?
I think we covered a lot of ground. I would emphasize, as you say, that there's a need for an information backbone of some sort, whether that's an open source social media platform or other things. There's been a failure of science, and there's been a failure of media and of places to honestly debate factual things, to bring in people who disagree, and not the pontification and nonstop spin that you see on CNN and so on. I mean, actually debating real issues. So I think that's been tremendous. I don't want to say failure, because it's very functional for the establishment that we don't have those critical discussions. But I think that I don't even want to say the left. I want to say people who want peace, non-interventionists, and so on. I think need to really scrutinize the issue of biological warfare and the tremendous threat that it poses to humanity. I think that there isn't enough attention paid to the threat of nuclear warfare, and there's even less attention, including by myself until recently, to the threat of biological warfare.
I like how you put it, people who want peace and non-interventionists. That fits under a wide variety of people. And so I guess we would point listeners to your website, which is husseini.posthaven.com, correct?
Correct. And my last two pieces, as well as my questioning of the CDC on February 11th, is up there, as well as many past pieces. And I hope to continue writing on this.
And you're also on Twitter, which is a valuable resource information that you post there. And we thank you for now. Yeah. All right. So we thank you, Mr. Husseini, for the work that you do, for asking the critical questions, for getting kicked out of conferences for us, and for fighting for a more peaceful world.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast and interview. I would like to remind you that our website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and you can sign up for our mailing list that goes out each weekend with the latest podcast and a long collection of important news headlines. It's good to sign up for the newsletter in case we experience censorship and deplatforming. You can help the Geopolitics and Empire podcast by subscribing to and interacting with all of our channels such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, Minds, and Steemit. You can also help us by leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platforms such as iTunes, Castbox, Stitcher, Spreaker, and so on. Finally, if you value our work and our mission and would like to see us continue interviewing experts from across the political spectrum, please consider leaving a one-time donation via PayPal or Bitcoin, or becoming a regular monthly supporter on our Patreon. All the links can be found on geopoliticsandempire.com. Thanks for listening.